If you were born after the turn of the millennium, looking back at archive footage of 1970s Britain might feel like watching a low-budget sci-fi dystopia. It looks like a world where seatbelts were essentially decorative, the air inside a public bus was composed of 40% industrial tobacco smoke, and child safety was left largely to the laws of physics rather than the laws of Parliament. To modernize, looking at how we lived back then feels genuinely terrifying. But to those of us who grew up in it, it wasn't a survival experiment, it was just Tuesday. We often see lists of things that are now banned, but we rarely ask the important question: why? Why did our parents, who loved us just as much as parents do today, allow us to rattle around in the back of cars like loose change? Why were playgrounds built on concrete slabs? Was it negligence, or was it simply a different kind of trust? Today, we aren't just listing the rules we broke, we are going to explore why society functioned that way, the hidden logic behind the chaos, and the sheer miracle that our generation is still here to tell the tale. So, sit back, relax, and maybe put on a seatbelt just in case, as we step back into the glorious, dangerous freedom of the 1970s. Let's start where we spent our Saturdays, the local playground. To the modern observer, a 1970s playground looks less like a recreational area and more like a training camp for stuntmen. If you visit a park today, you are greeted with soft, spongy rubber flooring, colorful plastic, and safety nets. The design philosophy is clear: if a child falls, they should bounce. But in the 1970s, the local council had a very different philosophy. They prioritized durability over biology. The ground wasn't rubber, it was concrete, unforgiving industrial-grade concrete. The logic was purely economic. Knees heal for free, but tarmac costs money to replace. And then there was the equipment itself. Center stage was usually occupied by the metal slide. On a grey afternoon, it was just a slide, but in the height of July, under the rare British sun, that sheet of stainless steel transformed into a branding iron. Going down it in shorts wasn't play, it was a test of endurance. You didn't glide, you sizzled. The screeching sound of skin against hot metal was just the soundtrack of summer. But nothing commands respect and fear quite like the witch's hat. For the uninitiated, this was a heavy, cone-shaped iron pendulum that spun on a central axis. The goal was simple: get it spinning as fast as physically possible, jump on, and try not to die. There were no safety harnesses, no speed governors, and certainly no soft landing. It was a brutal lesson in centrifugal force. If your grip failed, physics took over and you were launched into the atmosphere to meet the concrete below. Looking back, it seems insane, but there is a counter-argument to be made here. Those playgrounds were our first real lessons in risk assessment. You learned very quickly that gravity doesn't negotiate and that actions have immediate, painful consequences. We didn't have risk assessments filled out in triplicate, we had scabs on our knees. And in a strange way, that iron and concrete jungle taught us exactly where our limits were. If you managed to survive the playground with your bones intact, walking home presented a whole new set of challenges. Because the 1970s wasn't just dangerous to touch, it was dangerous to breathe. If you close your eyes and think of a 1970s petrol station, you can probably smell it right now. That sweet metallic tang of 4-star petrol. We didn't just tolerate that smell, we actually liked it. It was the scent of progress, of family holidays, of freedom. But that sweet smell was, of course, lead. For decades, we were pumping tons of neurotoxins directly into the air at head height, which, unfortunately, is exactly where children keep their brains. We now know that blood lead levels in 1970s children were dangerously high, linked to everything from behavioral issues to lowered IQ scores.
It's a sobering thought, though it might explain some of the questionable wallpaper choices and haircuts of the era. But while our heads were in the lead clouds, our eyes had to be firmly on the ground, because walking down a British street in the 70s was like navigating a minefield. We need to talk about the great lost icon of the decade, white dog poo. Younger viewers think this is a myth, but those of us who were there know the truth. It was everywhere. Calcified, chalky, white monstrosities crumbling on every street corner. And then, quite suddenly, it vanished from history.
Why, it wasn't that dogs evolved, it was the diet. Dog food in the 70s was cheap, bulked out with massive amounts of bone meal. All that calcium had to go somewhere, and it ended up drying white on the pavement. And it stayed there because the concept of a dog poo bag simply did not exist. If a dog made a mess, that was just nature taking its course. The idea that a human being would bend down, pick it up with a plastic bag and carry it around, well, in 1975, that would have been considered absolute madness. So there we were, breathing in lead, dodging calcified calcium, and thinking this was the pinnacle of modern living. Perhaps the most jarring difference between then and now wasn't the physical environment, but the social status of a child. In the 1970s, an 8-year-old wasn't just a child, they were a courier. It was a standard Saturday ritual. You would be dispatched to the corner shop, clutching a crumpled handwritten note from your mother and a 50-pence piece. You'd march up to the counter, chin barely clearing the wood, and place your order. 20 Embassy number 6, please. Today, this scene would trigger a police investigation and a call to social services. But back then, the shopkeeper didn't blink. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask where your parents were. He simply reached up to the shelf, grabbed the red and white packet, and handed it over, maybe even throwing in a penny chew for your trouble. It is easy to look back at this as negligence, but that misses the point. It was actually about community. In a world before mobile phones and digital surveillance, society ran on a currency of familiarity. The shopkeeper knew you. He knew your dad. He knew exactly who those cigarettes were for. It was a closed loop of trust that has largely evaporated from modern life. We weren't being neglected. We were being deputized. But if deputizing children to buy tobacco sounds risky, consider that we were also allowed to purchase high-grade explosives. November was a lawless time. You didn't buy a safe, pre-packaged selection box of fireworks. You bought them loose, one by one, like pick-and-mix sweets. They were called penny bangers, small red tubes of gunpowder designed solely to make a deafening noise.
You could walk into a shop with your pocket money and walk out with a brown paper bag full of ballistics. And what did we do with them? We didn't wait for a supervised display. We blew up milk bottles. We put them under buckets to see how high they would fly. We terrorized the neighborhood cats. It was unsupervised chaos. The government eventually banned them, realizing that perhaps selling gunpowder to bored 10-year-olds wasn't the soundest policy, but for a while we really were the masters of our own destruction. If you survived the playground and the explosive penny bangers, you still had to survive the journey home. And the vehicle of choice was usually a Ford Cortina or an Austin Allegro, cars that were essentially steel boxes filled with vinyl and cigarette smoke. In the 1970s, the back seat was a lawless zone. Seatbelts in the rear weren't mandatory to wear until 1991, so we were basically just loose cargo. If your dad took a corner too sharp, the children would slide across the vinyl bench seat like bowling pins. It was less like travel and more like a contact sport. We didn't have airbags or crumple zones. Instead, we had something called the mum seatbelt. You know exactly what I mean. The moment the driver hit the brakes, your mother's left arm would instinctively shoot out across your chest to hold you back. Now, in terms of physics, her arm would have snapped like a twig in a real crash. It was completely useless against kinetic energy. but emotionally it was the strongest safety device known to man. But the car wasn't just for transport. On weekends, it doubled as a waiting room. This brings us to a peculiar British institution, the pub car park kid. Children weren't allowed inside pubs, but parents wanted a drink. The solution was simple: leave the kids in the car. For hours. If you grew up in this era, you have a vivid memory of sitting in a freezing car park, bored out of your mind, armed with nothing but a packet of salt and vinegar crisps and a bottle of lemonade. It was a strange form of solitary confinement. You'd draw pictures in the condensation on the windows, watch the door of the pub, and wait for your parents to emerge.
And when they did emerge, well, that leads us to the most terrifying statistic of all. One for the road wasn't just a saying, it was a plan. Breathalyzers existed, but the culture hadn't caught up. There was a genuine, widespread belief that a few pints actually helped you drive better, that it made you more relaxed and more focused. It was a staggering collective delusion. We were being driven home by people operating heavy machinery under the influence, navigating dark country lanes with dim headlights, while we bounced around unbuckled in the back. It is a miracle of probability that the Ford Cortina didn't become the most dangerous weapon in British history. Looking back at this catalogue of hazards, the toxic air, the concrete playgrounds, the unbuckled back seats, and the casual handling of explosives, it is tempting to ask, what were they thinking? By modern standards, the 1970s looks less like a childhood and more like a negligence lawsuit waiting to happen. And let's be clear, we aren't arguing that lead poisoning was a character-building exercise or that flying through a windscreen was a rite of passage. The world today is objectively safer. Fewer children get hurt, and that is a triumph of civilization. But as we sanitized our streets and padded our playgrounds, did we lose something in the process? There was a raw, unfiltered quality to growing up in the 70s. Because the world didn't bend over backwards to keep us safe, we had to learn to keep ourselves safe. We learned the hard way that metal gets hot, that gravity hurts, and that actions have consequences. We roamed free, we took risks, we made mistakes, and we solved our own problems before our parents even knew we were in trouble. We traded that freedom for safety. It was probably a smart trade. But for those of us who lived through it, who carry the faint scar on our knee from a concrete fall or the memory of that terrifying witch's hat, we carry it like a badge of honour. We are the generation that defied the odds. We are the survivors of the concrete jungle. And while we're glad our grandchildren are buckled up and breathing clean air, we will always have the memory of that wild, dangerous, beautiful freedom. If you have a story about surviving the 70s or a scar to prove it, let me know in the comments below. I'm the Nostalgia Brit, and I'll see you next time on the Nostalgia Brit. Cheers.